Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey, 14. Scotty was not surprised that Scrub had left. It was logical the dog might head back for Aurora to look for David. What amazed him was that he had tried so soon. As stiff and battered as he seemed to be, he doubted the dog would get far, so he spent half the day searching the brush and tundra for several miles in the direction of Aurora. He expected to find Scrub lying somewhere exhausted. There was no sign of him. He wondered what the dog would do when he found no one at David's old home. He might go wild. He looked enough like a wolf to join a pack. Scotty hoped Scrub would return to him. If he didn't, he decided he'd get another pup. With Fred, Celia, and David gone, and no one to visit once in a while, he needed some kind of company. Scotty spent the rest of the day repairing the rifles in his sluice boxes. Repairing the riffles in his sluice boxes. The next morning, he got his boat into the river and loaded the sluice boxes. The powerful outboard motor ferried them the half-mile upriver to the little feeder stream he planned to work. He took the rest of the day to set the boxes. The following morning, he began prospecting the creek bottom. By noon, he knew it was worth working, but it was not rich. Scotty hiked back to the cabin for lunch. He was about to enter when Smiley Jackson stepped from the nearby trees and came toward him. Scotty asked, "What brings you here, Smiley?" "Going home," Jackson said. "Racing season's over." "How'd you do?" Jackson shrugged. "Won some and lost some. Got a good price for the team, so I sold it. I'll get a better one for next year." Same old Smiley Jackson, Scotty thought. "Come in, I'll put the coffee pot on." The courtesy of the trail could not be denied. Jackson followed Scotty inside, slipped the pack from his back, and sat down. He looked about the cabin while Scotty lit the stove and began getting lunch. It was the first time he'd ever been inside Scotty's place. There was a whip hanging on the wall, and Jackson asked, "You want to sell that? I lost mine." Scotty shook his head. "It's sort of a keepsake now." The door of the back room was open, and Jackson saw a large pile of furs. "I thought you quit trapping years ago when you lost your hand." "I did." "What's all the fur doing here?" Jackson rose and walked into the back room. Scotty frowned. Living alone, he paid little attention whether doors were open or closed, whether things were in sight or not. "That fur belongs to Davy Martin," he said. "It's what him and his pa caught before the accident. Fur buyer will be coming in about 3 days, and I'll sell it for Davy. I remember hearing his folks froze to death." Jackson ran a hand over several pelts. "Nice-looking fur. They was having a mighty good year. There must be $7,000 or $8,000 worth here." Scotty kept his eyes on the frying pans where potatoes and caribou steaks were frying. There was no use denying it. Jackson knew the value of fur. "Could be," he said. "Depends on the price this year." "Oh, sure." Jackson came back into the kitchen and sat down. They ate in almost complete silence. Scotty asked once, "Whatever happened to that big leader you had?" "Scrub, I told you I sold the team." Scotty nodded. "Saw him once. I thought he had the makings of a good leader." "Did have, but Fred Martin's kid spoiled him." "How?" Scotty asked. "Made a pet of him. Can't do that with a sled dog. It ruins him." Jackson's eyes strayed to the open door of the back room. "That fur buyer coming right up here to the cabin?" "Frank Weathers has floats on his plane. Ice has gone out of the river, so he'll land and run right up to the bank." Jackson nodded. "That fur is as nice as I've ever seen. It'll bring top dollar." "Could be," Scotty agreed. "You're selling it for the kid?" Scotty nodded. He'd never known Jackson to talk so much. "Weathers will pick up the fur here. We'll settle on a price, and he'll deliver the money to Davy in Anchorage." "The kid ever coming back?" "I don't think so. He's living with his dad's relatives." Jackson finished his lunch in silence and rose and slipped on the pack. "Gotta get moving. Want to make home by tomorrow night." His eyes went to the back room again. "A lot of money for a kid to be getting," he observed. "Davy and his uncle will find a use for it," Scotty said. Jackson shook his head. "Too much for any kid, just too much. What's a kid know about money?" He nodded to Scotty by way of thanks and left. Scotty watched him go off downriver and disappear into the brush. Then he cleared up the lunch dishes, took up the rifle, and hiked off upriver to his sluice boxes. He was glad Smiley Jackson was gone. Jackson did not go far. He couldn't get the picture of the fur. He couldn't get the picture of that pile of fur out of his mind. He sat on a stump and thought about it. There was a lot of money represented there. More than the first prize of the fur rendezvous or the North American. Maybe twice as much as he'd got for selling the team. More than enough to take care of all his problems, he thought greedily. With that much money, he could buy a new team, one already trained and ready to run, and there'd be more than enough left to keep them in style until next winter's racing season. This time, he wouldn't have to start with a bunch of unruly pups that he'd raised himself, spend months culling and trying to build them into a team. He wouldn't have to worry about a sponsor to help pay entry fees and feed bills. There might even be enough left over to get a truck to carry the dogs and sled around in. All that money was going to a kid. The kid who'd ruined his lead dog, who'd caused him to lose the prize money and the honor of winning the fur rendezvous. That Martin kid should have to repay him for his losses. It'd be a way to get revenge on the kid, he thought angrily. Jackson went quietly back through the trees where he could watch Scotty's cabin. He saw Scotty leave and head upriver carrying the rifle. He waited another half hour, then convinced Scotty would remain working at his sluice boxes the rest of the afternoon. He went to the cabin. The door was unlocked and Jackson walked in. He stood looking at the pile of furs, his mind busy. He could load the fur into Scotty's boat. Current motor and combined would take him flying downriver. He'd be 70 or 80 miles away by the time Scotty returned. But wouldn't Scotty immediately miss the furs and his boat and guess who'd taken them? Jackson was worrying about that when he became aware of two things: a red gasoline can in the corner and that the cabin was unusually hot. He lifted a stove lid and looked into the firebox. Scotty hadn't doused the fire when he left. Then he had it. The stove and the gas can were the answers. He was surprised at how simple and foolproof it would be. He'd load the fur into the boat, then scatter gas over the floor, and set fire to the cabin. When Scotty returned, he'd find nothing but a heap of smoldering ashes. Scotty would jump to the logical conclusion that he'd left a fire in the stove, and that somehow it had spread to the cabin. The missing boat was the only thing that worried Jackson. Scotty would have to think that the boat had broken loose and the fast current had drifted away. He couldn't prove otherwise. Jackson knew a man about 100 miles downriver who'd buy the fur and ask no questions. For a little extra, he'd keep his mouth shut. But this time tomorrow, he'd have the fur sold and the boat sunk in some deep hole where there'd be no trace. Jackson got to working immediately. He made the fur into bales and began carrying them to the boat. He was returning from the first trip when he thought he glimpsed a gray animal watching him from the brush. It faded from sight, and he wasn't sure he'd seen anything. 2 more trips took all the fur. He was going to the cabin for the last time when he caught a definite movement in the brush. Jackson walked over to the spot but saw nothing. To have any eyes watching gave him an uncomfortable feeling. He had a rifle. He'd hunt the animal down. If he had a rifle, he'd hunt the animal down. In the cabin, Jackson filled the stove with wood and opened the draft to get the fire roaring. Next, he scattered gas about the floor. He was reaching for the bottle of matches on the shelf above the window when he glanced outside. Scotty was walking toward the cabin. Jackson looked about frantically for a weapon. Scotty's old whip, with its long, hard handle, was the only one he saw. He snatched it down and stepped to one side of the door. Scotty swung the door open, went straight to the stove, and lifted one of the lids. He was looking into the firebox when Jackson brought the butt of the whip down on his head. Scotty collapsed and lay still. Jackson found rope and bound Scotty tight to a chair before he regained consciousness. Scotty groaned and straightened. He blinked his eyes and shook his head to clear it. He strained on the ropes, binding his arms and legs to the chair. They were very tight. Then he looked up at Jackson. "Why'd you come back, you crazy fool?" Jackson demanded. "I got to thinking of that pile of fur and the way you talked. I wanted to make sure you'd left. I should have been careful coming in," Scotty sniffed. "Gasoline! You were going to burn my cabin down. What'd you do with all the furs?" He twisted his head around, trying to look into the back room. "You should have stayed up there shoveling gravel," Jackson said bitterly. Scotty looked at him steadily. "What'll you do now?" Jackson scowled. The scar on his cheek was an angry streak. He'd come this far. He meant to have the money those furs would bring. He thought briefly of leaving Scotty tied to the chair and setting fire to the cabin. The binding ropes would burn off. Scotty would be found dead, probably by the pilot due here 3 days from now. It would still look like an accident that had trapped Scotty. He discarded that idea. Murder was not part of Jackson's makeup. Besides, the police never stopped looking for a murderer. There had to be another way. "You've got a problem," Scotty said, "a real problem." Jackson ignored him and kept thinking of his original plan. It could still work. Just before taking off, he'd loosened Scotty's bonds enough so he could free himself in time. With only one hand, that would be a very slow job. Scotty would have to hike to Aurora 30 miles away to call the police by shortwave. It would be about 3 days before they came. He'd be long gone. Scotty couldn't prove a thing against him. His story would mean nothing without proof. But it would be healthier to get out of the country for a while. There was a lot he could do with that much money. "Got it all figured out, eh?" Scotty said. "You really think you can get away with it?" "Shut up." "I always knew you were dumb," Scotty said. "I didn't know you were a fool, too." "We'll see." Jackson laid the rifle on the table and bent to loosen Scotty's bonds. He saw Scotty's eyes flick to the door, the look of surprise that widened them. Jackson turned his head quickly. A big wolf-gray animal stood just outside the open door. His head was tipped down slightly, his amber eyes slanted upward, studying Jackson. "Scrub!" Jackson could hardly believe it. Scrub should have got hung up with that chain around his neck and starved to death days ago. All the trouble he'd had the past year could be traced to this dog. Jackson grabbed for the rifle. Scrub was gone in an instant. Jackson rushed outside, slamming the door. There was no dog. He dashed around the cabin in time to glimpse the wolfish shape fade into the trees. He waited, hoping Scrub would show himself. Minutes passed. Jackson wanted to hunt the dog down and kill him, but he didn't dare take the time. He had to get away from here. He waited a few more minutes and returned to the front of the cabin. Jackson was about to open the door when a figure with a pack on its back emerged from the trees. With a shock, Jackson recognized David Martin. He glanced toward the boat. It was in plain sight to the boy. The fur was visible. Jackson went to meet David. He approached at an angle that made the boy turn his back to the boat to face him. "What are you doing here, kid?" Jackson asked. "I stopped to see Scotty." David seemed as surprised and uncomfortable as Jackson. "Scotty said he was living in Anchorage with relatives." The man's lips twitched nervously in the permanent smile. His eyes never quite met David's. "I'm going home." "To Aurora? You're going to live there alone?" "Yes." David glanced about. Why was Jackson here? Why was he walking around Scotty's carrying a rifle as if he'd been hunting? "Don't you like the big city?" "Aurora's home." Jackson had never talked to him before. Why was he now? "Where's Scotty?" "Checking his sluice boxes. He's got him in a creek about half a mile upriver." David wanted to ask about Scrub, but he was afraid of touching off Jackson's hair-trigger temper. He asked, "Are you heading for Aurora?" Jackson nodded. "Had a cup of coffee with Scotty. I'm leaving now." David stepped beyond Jackson, glanced about, puzzled. Then he saw the boat pulled up against the bank, the pile of furs inside. Jackson said, "Scotty's taking it downriver to buy some fur. Scotty's taking it downriver to some fur buyer." There was something here David didn't understand. "I'd almost forgot," he said. "Scotty did say he'd sell for me. Guess I won't wait. I'll see him later." David headed up past the cabin, Jackson trailing him closely. As he came opposite the cabin, he noticed smoke pouring from the stovepipe. He turned quickly, stepped to the cabin, and threw open the door. Scotty looked up from where he sat bound to the chair. "Davy!" he said. "What are you doing here?" The rifle muzzle jammed hard into David's back, and Jackson said, "Welcome to the party." Scotty said, "Davy, you shouldn't have come." "I knew something was wrong when I saw the fur in the boat and smoke coming from the stovepipe," David said. "Nothing's wrong," Jackson said. "You're paying back what you made me lose at the fur rendezvous." "That's no excuse for tying up Scotty like this." "It is now." "You must be crazy," David said. "Then you'd better face against that wall and put your hands behind your back like I say." Jackson reached for a length of rope. Scotty yanked at the bonds. "What are you going to do to him?" "Same thing I did to you." "You'll never get away with it. Best thing you can do is turn us loose and get out of here." "Too late for that, Jackson said. "Get against that wall, kid." David backed up, eyes darting about for some kind of weapon. There was nothing but a butcher knife on the table. There was movement at the door behind Jackson. A gray wolf-like animal was looking in. His amber eyes sprung wide open as he looked at David. His bushy tail began to whip and his mouth opened wide in a dog-like grin. The sight of the dog he thought he'd never see again so startled David that he yelled, "Scrub!" Jackson yanked the rifle around. David dived for the barrel, got hold of it, and tried to wrench it away. Jackson let go with one hand and drove his fist into David's face. David fell, still clutching the barrel. Jackson struck and yanked and struck again. The rifle was torn from the boy's hands. David was trying to get to his knees, but Scrub launched himself through the door with a snarl of rage. He drove straight for Jackson's throat. His big teeth missed and clamped down on the forearm thrown up to ward him off. He ripped through cloth and into the arm. Jackson stumbled back with a cry of fright and pain. The rifle clattered to the floor. The dog's driving weight threw Jackson off balance, and he fell on his back. Scrub was on him, snarling horribly. Razor-sharp teeth slashed at the arms. The man threw over his face to protect himself. David snatched up the rifle and jumped to his feet. Scotty tore at his bonds, yelling, "Cut me loose, Davy! Cut me loose!" David grabbed the butcher knife and severed the ropes. Jackson fought off Scrub and got to his feet. He aimed a wild kick at the dog, then ran blindly for the door. Scrub leaped again. Jackson stumbled against the table and went to his knees. He let out a bawl of fright and grabbed for the raging dog to hold him off. Scrub's teeth sank into his hand. The dog was all over him. It was as if he were paying Jackson back for the beatings the man had given him during the winter. Scrub was a slashing, ripping demon. Every time the man struck or tried to shove the dog off, he exposed his face and throat to those snapping teeth were right after him. Those snapping teeth were right after him. Finally, Jackson doubled himself into a knot on the floor, arms wrapped about his face and neck, and yelled in terror, "Get him off me! Get him off me!" The sound of his nasal voice infuriated the dog more. He tore at the protecting arms. His flashing teeth shredded Jackson's coat and shirt. Scotty threw off the last of the ropes, grabbed the rifle from David, and said, "Pull off your dog before he kills Jackson." "Pull off your dog before he kills Jackson." David got his arms around Scrub's neck and dragged him off. The dog kept growling, snarling, and lunging against David's arms, trying to break free. David said sharply, "Cut that out! Stop it! Here!" He cuffed Scrub's ears, and the snarling gradually sank to a growl, but the dog never took his eyes from Jackson. Scotty said, "You can get up now." Jackson got shakily to his feet and collapsed on the bench, arms hanging at his sides. Both arms and his left hand were torn and bleeding. The front of his shirt was ripped away, and 2 big marks showed how close Scrub had come to his throat. Jackson looked at Scrub as if he'd never seen the dog before. He kept muttering, "Hang on to him. Keep him off me. Keep him off. He's gone mad." Scrub's amber eyes were fixed on Jackson with almost human hate, and the growl rumbling from his chest never stopped. David asked, "What do we do now?" "First off," Scotty said, "we better patch him up. Put Scrub in the other room." David shoved the growling Scrub into the back room and closed the door. Scrub scratched and growled. Scotty handed David the rifle, "Just in case he gets ideas." Then he went to work on Jackson's arms and hands with disinfectants and bandages. The only sounds were Scrub's growling and scratching. Scotty finally finished and said, "All right, now get out." "No," David said, "we're taking him into Aurora and calling the police." "We can do that," Scotty agreed. "And we can have him put in jail for some time. There'll be a trial, and we'll have to go to Anchorage to testify against him. That could take weeks and be a lot of inconvenience and trouble. I don't think he's worth it." "So he gets off scot-free?" David said angrily. "No such thing," Scotty fixed Jackson with a tough look. "I figure to let you go, but if you're smart, you'll get out of this part of the country fast. I'm going to swear out a warrant for your arrest the first time I get to a shortwave station and can call the police. That warrant's going to hang over your head from now on. If you ever show up around here again, the police will be notified and you'll be arrested. Then Davy and I will take the time to go in and testify against you. Now take your pack and get out of here." Jackson stood up uncertainly. "That dog in there's mine." He don't sound like yours, Scotty said. "Still mine." "He stays here," David said. "He's legally mine." "We're buying him from you," Scotty said. "Davy, get a pencil and paper and write what I say." David found a pencil, and Scotty dictated, "For the sum of $1, I have sold to David Martin 1 wolf-gray dog that answers to the name of Scrub. Put down the date, Smiley. Sign it. Davy, give him $1. "He's a lead dog," Jackson said angrily. "He's worth 1,000. $1, Scotty said. "Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, you go in that room alone and take him out." "That's how you figure to get back at me," Jackson said. "Cheating me out of my dog." $1, Scotty repeated. "Or you go in there and get him." Jackson looked at the closed door behind which Scrub growled and scratched. He swallowed nervously. Then he laboriously signed his name and started to go out. Pick up your dollar, Jackson said sharply, or this sale's not legal. Jackson turned and glared at him. Make up your mind, Scotty warned. I'm not going to leave the dog in that room much longer. Jackson picked up the dollar and stomped out. David and Scotty followed. Jackson started downriver. Not that way, Scotty called. That's my home. Where else can I go? Jackson yelled. It's a big country. Just remember to stay away from here. Jackson looked about uncertainly, then he headed upriver and disappeared to the trees. That's the last we'll ever see of him, Scotty said. Let your dog out before he wrecks the back room. When David opened the door, Scrub tore out, ready to do battle to protect him. David fell to his knees and began to shake the big head. Smiley Jackson's gone forever, he laughed. You're mine now. All mine. Quit acting so tough. Scrub jumped on David then, whining and licking his face and barking wildly. Boy and dog rolled on the ground in a threshing bundle of arms and legs, barks and yells. Scotty watched until they stopped. Now, he smiled, let's get the fur back to the cabin and clean up the place. Evening shadows had darkened the kitchen when they finished. David filled Scotty in on most of what had happened to him in Anchorage. Now he sat rubbing Scrub's head and said, Scrub and I are going back to Aurora to live. We'll run the trap line. That's a long line for one man, Scotty reminded him. Your dad was one of the best, and I know how tough he found it. I've thought about that, and I'd like to have a partner, but it'd have to be somebody I knew and could get along with. David kept rubbing the dog's head. Scotty, he asked finally, would you be interested in going partners with me? Me? Scotty asked, surprised. I've got an awful lot to learn. And you could teach me. I'd be another pair of hands to your one, David said in a rush. We could live in this cabin or mine. Yours would be better, Scotty said. It's bigger, more centrally located, and there's that sled out back to keep the fur in. Gee, David said, would you? I've been wanting to get back for a long time, Scotty confessed. There was just no good way before. Then you'll do it? We could work the line like your dad did, Scotty said thoughtfully. Dad and Mom would sure like it if they knew, David said hopefully. I kind of think they would at that, Scotty agreed. Then it's a deal? It's a deal. They shook hands. Now that we've got our futures settled, how about something to eat? Scotty asked. He stirred up the fire and got out a frying pan and mixing bowl. I'd say this calls for a celebration and something special. What'll it be? Anything you say, David smiled, knowing what was coming. Anybody for bacon pancakes? That's fine. Scotty looked at Scrub. How about you, friend? David leaned over and rubbed his cheek against Scrub's furry forehead. This is a special celebration for you, too, he said. You got rid of Smiley Jackson forever today, so what do you have? Scrub lifted his lips in a grin and thumped his tail on the floor. We're all agreed, Scotty said. Bacon pancakes it is. And that is the end of Scrub Dog of Alaska. I had a really good time reading you guys this one. A lot of language in it that sometimes I censor. I didn't in this one because this is mostly how the natives were talked about in this book. I felt like it was necessary, and the writer probably did too, to show how Alaskan natives were treated at this time. I have to remind you, because I didn't say at the beginning, this book was written in the very early 70s, but I think that politically it still holds up, and certainly 30 years ago when my teacher read it to me, she thought it held up at the time as well. We have one more dog book before we get through all the dog books, but next will be something by Madeline L'Engle, so we will see you in the next video.